Okay, so we talked about monsoons, these seasonal rainfall patterns. Why they're a big deal is because they are tied to agriculture in this part of the world. And the main type of agriculture in South Asia and East Asia is primarily intensive subsistence agriculture. Subsistence agriculture, again, is where you grow food for your family or your community rather than purely for as a business for selling. Although people do, sell it in farmers markets and in their villages, but the food is grown to be eaten. And it's intensive because intensive is around the growing of what's called cereals, especially rice. So rice is very important. When we look, so I'll cut to the short of it. The reason why you have such dense, high populations in South Asia and East Asia, it's primarily because of rice, because you can feed a lot of people with a relatively small amount of land. In many places, they use terracing, that use terracing to grow, greater amount of rice, even where you don't have flat land. And why the monsoons are important is because they provide the right seasons. You need a wet season in the summer when you can flood the rice fields, but you also need a dry season in the winter where the land can recover. So the monsoons and rice have kind of, rice is well adapted to monsoon conditions. So we've talked about domestication, how, how that raised the carrying capacity, but rice in particular really cranked the carrying capacity up, or how many people can live in a certain place, because a relatively small amount of land growing rice can feed a lot of people. All right, so we talked about the agricultural revolution, domestication, humans control the evolution of plants. And India is probably the most impacted place by what's called the Green Revolution. Right, so we have the agricultural revolution, domestication. We also have the Industrial Revolution. We talked about commercial agriculture, technologies and trade have changed agriculture into less subsistence, into more agribusiness or commercial agriculture. Grow more stuff, make higher profits. And the idea of the Green Revolution is to take the technologies of commercial agriculture and apply them to subsistence agriculture. In other words, take the technology. So in your recent paper, we talked about the high-tech stuff that the US does to remain competitive in agriculture. Try to take some of that high-tech, high technology and transfer that to places like India, and try to make Indian agriculture look more like US agriculture. And this is something that was happening during the Cold War. It was meant to it wasn't just to help people, but to make allies during the Cold War period. However, there's two sides to it. The really good side is that it really stabilized the food supply in many places. This is a chart showing the production of rice and wheat in India from the 1950s to the 1990s. And you can see it really increased dramatically. However, there's side effects as well. That commercial agriculture requires a lot of inputs, chemical fertilizers, various things. And I'm going to show a video. I'm going to include a video that talks about the Green Revolution in India, and you'll see some of that some of the Green Revolution varieties didn't grow well because the farmer couldn't afford chemical fertilizers. It also impacts how many people can live in the rural communities, because to create more efficiency, like in the US, we grow a lot of food with fewer people. And when you apply that efficiency into a rural environment, what happens is that you can grow more food with fewer people, but the remaining people who are no longer needed flock to the cities. And that creates what's called rural to urban migration. It displaces people from the countryside, and those people flood into the cities and sometimes live in poor conditions. And then lastly, it reduces the diversity of crops. And this is going to be best illustrated in the video that I'm going to include that talks about the traditional Indian agriculture and people trying to bring back some of these traditional crops. So we've talked a little bit about this in the introduction to the course, and the problems with reductions in diversity is we may lose some varieties of food that we have grown in the past, and those varieties may be better suited to future conditions. So a century ago, these are the types of how many seeds you could buy for different crops, like 408 for tomatoes. Now that's down to 79. So there's been a reduction because the remaining ones were not as profitable, so that people stopped selling them and they become scarce. And so I'll include a video on the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. What this is a really an interesting project that is attempting to kind of save some of our varieties of seeds from going extinct. So it's kind of a seed bank that's up in the Arctic where countries from all over the world will send the varieties of their different crops, so that if there is massive, if there is a massive problem like with climate change or whatever else, that we have the seed stock to try to rebuild our food supply. So what's wrong with losing traditional varieties of plants of different foods? That they may be adapted to the local conditions, to the climate and other physical characteristics. And normally I would show this in class, but I'm just going to include it with the lecture. And just one last thing on agriculture while I have this figure up, that in India, rice is incredibly important. It's this area in green. This is where the monsoons are at their wettest, but India is not all one thing. So there is other crops like wheat and millet and other grains that are grown as well. So there's a variety of agriculture, but rice is very important.